So we're picking up in this video with labor movements and socialism. And we've talked about how bad the working conditions and the living conditions were during this time. And so the working class began to organize to improve their labor conditions. And the first political organization was called the London Corresponding Committee, founded in 1792. And after this, unskilled workers increasingly began to join unions. And unions would fight for better working conditions, better hours, better pay, things like that. And then by 1914, again, the year that World War I started, there were 4 million Britons that were members of the trade union. And so Karl Marx and the Workers' Revolution. So in Great Britain, workers started organizations, and then politicians followed up with socialist-like laws. There were other places where politicians took the lead and workers followed, but Karl Marx called for a worker-led revolution in the Communist Manifesto. And he criticized capitalism in Das Kapital. And he believed that since it was the workers who produced everything, that they should receive the wealth. And he believed that that should be accomplished through a violent revolution, a violent overthrow of government. And he wanted a worker-led government. And this would be temporary until society was set up to run by itself. And eventually the government would fade away into a utopia. This was the plan. And Karl Marx believed that all conflicts and all wars throughout history were caused by class struggles, or rich versus poor. And in his case, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, versus the proletariat, the working class. And so it's important to note that the guy he was working with was a guy named Frederick Engels. And Engels had reported on the terrible conditions, I believe in Manchester, and he worked with Marx to further their plan to socialize Europe. So labor organizations, and we're starting with Austria and Germany. So there were protesting workers and students in Prague and Vienna that briefly took control of those places in 1848, but they were very harshly suppressed by the army, thousands of casualties. And in Prussia in 1848, there were many young workers who demanded a new constitution with more democracy and workers' rights. But in the end, that wasn't really successful for them because King Frederick William IV of Prussia claimed divine right. In other words, God made me the king, and so I'm rejecting your constitution. In Germany, that played out a little bit differently. Otto von Bismarck was the Chancellor of Germany, and he worked with the socialists and the workers, but only because he wanted to keep them loyal to the state. So to sort of silence the socialists, he carried out some of their plans. He opposed the political party, the Social Democratic Party, but he gave workers disability. He gave them health insurance, he gave them accident insurance, and old age pensions, and the first Social Security in Europe. So in Germany, Otto von Bismarck brought social changes. And then in France, there were repeated worker revolts in France. And those were pretty much caused by low wages, poor working conditions, and displaced artisans, or craftsmen who had sort of been booted out by mass production. And so in 1848, there was a revolt against the leader of France at the time, a guy named Louis Napoleon, also called Napoleon III, which led to a provisional republic and the establishment of government-sponsored workshops that would employ the poor. Soon after that, though, there was a more conservative government that was elected, and they closed those workshops in Paris. And because they closed those workshops in Paris, poor people barricaded the streets, and more than 10,000 people were killed or injured in street riots. And so the French national government ended up executing 20,000 people and exiling 10,000 more in the Paris Commune. And the Paris Commune was like this temporary revolutionary socialist government that took over Paris for a couple of months. But Louis Napoleon really did a smart thing in 1848 when he hired Baron Haussmann to redesign the city. And this was a vast public works program that was, of course, commissioned by Emperor Napoleon III, or Louis Napoleon. And it included the demolition of crowded and unhealthy medieval neighborhoods. He built wide avenues, partly so that people couldn't barricade the streets anymore. He built parks and squares and annexed the surrounding suburbs of Paris. He constructed new sewers and fountains and aqueducts. And so this turned out to provide a lot of jobs for people. A decade later, however, the exiles returned and began to organize again. And by 1884, syndicates or labor unions became legal. And so these two competing labor unions were formed, but wealthy business leaders still continued to dominate French politics. So in the United States, after the Civil War, some craft unions began to form, and they formed the National Labor Union in 1866. And by the early 70s, they had 300,000 members. And there were a couple of other organizations that formed like this: the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor, that was a secret society, and then the Federation of Labor, which was a union of skilled craft workers, had 2 million members by the time World War I started. There were a series of strikes in the United States: the Homestead Steel Strike, the Pullman Palace Car Company strike, the Hatmakers strike. And these did turn violent, and the government had to send in the army in some of these cases to force workers to go back to work. But the United States didn't really develop a labor party or a political party that wholeheartedly endorsed socialist ideals. And the reason that didn't happen in the United States as it did in Europe was, one, because of the diverse ethnicities in the United States, but also because of the better pay scales. So workers in the non-industrialized world. So craftspeople were the fastest people to be displaced just because of the speed and the consistent quality of factories. And some of them had to go find work in fields that hadn't yet been overtaken by industry. For those in the poorest countries, indentured labor was an escape for this, particularly in China and India. And from 1831 to 1921, there were about 2 million people that immigrated to work mostly in sugar plantations. And because of displacement, they sort of had to do this. And there were other factors that encouraged this as well. For one, the end of slavery and the need for cheap labor. Also, they were producing more sugar globally and therefore needed more laborers. And so some of those people who had been displaced had to take jobs as indentured servants. New patterns of urban life. So this industrialization that was taking place happened in the city. And as cities grew, some middle-class people didn't like living in the city, so they moved to suburban areas. And this was made possible by buses and railroads and automobiles. But urban growth was a direct result of industrialization. And immigrants streamed into the new cities for jobs. Many people left the farm, or they were children of artisans who had been displaced and had to move into the city to find a job. And in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, of course, conditions were abysmal. But as productivity increased, the conditions did begin to improve. So looking at the nature of the city. And in Germany, there was a guy named Max Weber. It's spelled like Weber. And he analyzed the modern city. And he negatively contrasted it with the close-knit guilds and the political and religious associations of early self-governing European cities, especially the medieval ones. And many agreed with him, and they disliked the lack of industrial ties that had existed like the guilds had in the Middle Ages. They believed this led to a breakdown of the social fabric of society and the individual personality of a community. And in general, the sense of community was lost as people were regulated by operating a machine each day. And there was another guy, a German philosopher of history. His name was Oswald Spengler. And Spengler argued that urbanization ruined the spirit of the folk people who had built the city. He believed that the cosmopolitan city run by wealthy businessmen was inferior to the countryside of common folk. And then Adna Farren Weber, or Weber maybe, and Charles Booth did a quantitative study that resulted in a new academic discipline, sociology. And this is just the study of society, the study of community. So you can take sociology today if you go to college. But this is a discipline that they came up with in studying the nature of the city. So living in the city, there was a high level of immigrants. And because of that, there was urban diversity. And so urban diversity came to be accepted and valued and studied. People identified with their neighborhoods, which had a sense of community and a sense of individuality. Commercial areas were increasing in complexity and size, especially as many of these areas had department stores and coffee houses and restaurants and pubs and things like that. There were leisure areas that included museums and theaters and libraries. And the public sphere was becoming a place where people could gather to share ideas and goals and aspirations, almost like a modern Greek agora. And so transportation linked these places. With buses and things like that, people could travel to these different places. And another thing that changed the nature of the city and living in the city was the availability of steel, which made the construction of skyscrapers possible, and also the construction of elevators. So urban planning. Urban living and town planning came to be a profession. There were problems associated with living in the city. There was overcrowding, there was poor ventilation, inadequate sanitation, polluted, unclean water, alienation from nature, and poor health, especially tuberculosis. And so by the 1800s, town planners were looking for solutions to the question, how do we provide a space while fostering participation in both the local community and the metropolis as a whole? And there was a British reformer who first proposed a group of slumless, smokeless cities. And his name was Ebenezer Howard. And he came up with this idea, and he believed that it would have 250,000 people, and there would be 66,000 acres. This was proposed, I don't know that this was ever successful anywhere. It seemed like a good idea. Another idea was the Garden City Complex. And in this type of community, it would be a self-contained, planned town that combined work, residential areas, agriculture, and recreational facilities. And it would be surrounded by a rural belt. And so I guess you would have the best of all of those worlds. Okay, so this brings our Chapter 17 video lectures to a close.